Welcome back, and this is the home stretch. We'll be looking into the International Association for the Scientific Study of Intellectual and Development Disabilities. We'll be looking into issues concerning disabilities, and this is a group dedicated to the scientific study of intellectual disabilities. This year, the International Conference on Disabilities will be held in Nigeria for the first time. And so we have in the studio gentlemen, and let me start from my far right, and that is Mr. Ani Basi Eyo. Is the chairman, LOC International Conference on Disabilities and Specialty on Education.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us
this
morning. And we have a member, Committee of Experts, UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, Mr. Danlabi Basharu.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and of course we have the President, Beacon colleague, Florida, George Haggerty. Thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And of course, finally, but not the least, we have a member, Media Committee, LOC International Conference on Disability, Jide Fadoju. Did I get that right?
Good morning.
Okay, now we're talking disabilities. When we say disabilities, there's this image that comes, to people. It's that of helplessness and hopelessness. Is that what it is about?
I think actually that's why we're here, because we need to change the narrative. We need to have a paradigm shift. I was training a class 4 days ago, and I showed pictures of different people with disabilities. One was a kid with a crutch in a very impoverished background, and another was a child who had had an amputated leg in a Sahara-type Boko Haram environment, and the third was wonderful Kobum Zasukwa. And when I asked the class back, what do you see? For the first two, they saw a disabled person. That's what they said. But when I asked about Kobum, they said this man has arrived. So the question is, we need to change our mindset. We need to look at people not at their disability. We need to look at people for who they are. And this is one of the things this conference will do, amongst many other things. Disabilities is played in Nigeria as a very charitable model. The private sector is not very involved, and I represent the private sector here. I'm a businessman. Yes, I do have an NGO, but I have I've set up startup business and education in different sectors. And we, as a business community, need to engage with government and civil society to change how we view disabilities, to make sure that we don't just go and give people a bag of rice, we don't just give people a wheelchair, but make society more inclusive and, really reach out, because without an inclusive society, we're in trouble. And another thing I must point out is that Nigeria is a large country. It's one of it's the most populous country in Africa. 20% of our population have a disability or the other. When you look at that number, it's a colossal size, because that alone is the size of some of the neighboring countries. So we cannot exclude those persons out of mainstream society. We must bring them back, and we must make their life, we must ensure that each person functions to the fullest of his or her ability.
Okay, Mr. Basharu, how is, participating in this UN convention, how can this shape, all of these discussions?
Well, thank you very much. Nigeria has signed on to and ratified the convention and its optional protocol. In fact, Nigeria was one of the first to sign on to the convention. Unfortunately, having signed and ratified, we still are way behind in our obligations when it comes to the convention, because by Article 4 of the convention, we're supposed to have local legislation in place in Nigeria. We don't yet have a national disability legislation, and this we've been hankering around about for the lifetime of the previous government, about 16 years, trying to get a disability legislation. And that is having a telling effect really on people with disabilities in Nigeria, because you need legislation to really back a lot of things that ought to happen in the country, particularly in the area of accessibility. I'm sorry to say I was coming into your station today, and I was going up some steps, and I told my guide, let me have a look if they have anything for wheelchair users. And he took me to a place, and I thought, God, that cannot be a ramp. It was so steep. So we have a lot of issues when it comes to the convention itself. We have ratified it, but then we need a government that is really going to be empathetic towards ensuring that those rights that we have signed on to are made possible for Nigerians with disabilities. And we do that by starting to get the national disability legislation assented to by the president. Unfortunately, it has to go back to the National Assembly to start all afresh, which is another terrible thing. We've done this 3 times, going back and forth between the National Assembly, and it gets to the president, and it doesn't get assented to. I don't think it's good enough for Nigerians as the largest nation in Africa with the largest population of people with disabilities. I think we can do much better.
Okay, Mr. Duarte, what lessons can the Nigerian society draw from the U.S. In the area of another part of the world as regards managing people with disabilities?
Let me say that I've spent a considerable amount of time traveling around the world, and this is truly an international issue. This is not just a Nigerian issue or a U.S. issue. But the U.S. Early on, and this is the 1970s, we had the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and the extension of the civil rights movement into the 1970s was related to people with disabilities. So we had a federal law, Section 503 Rehabilitation Act, and then we had the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which mandated that all students, irrespective of disability, were entitled to a free and appropriate public education. So that meant that it was at no cost to the parents if they went to the public institutions, and that it had to be appropriate. It had to meet the needs of that individual child. I think that I was involved in the late 1970s in the writing of these regulations for the implementation of this within the schools. We had, I think, a very good model, but a very complex model for serving these students. And so as I take a look at some of the issues that we have, they are around the complexity and the legality of the model as opposed to really working on the things that really make sense educationally. And here is the most important feature, and we just had a discussion in the green room about this. The most important thing that can happen when you're putting into place a national model or even a local model is to make sure that the regular educators are well educated, that they have in-service education so that they can teach these students in an integrated environment. But probably the most important people that need to be educated are the parents and the families, as to what they should expect of not only their child, but of the school district in serving their child, the schools in serving their child.
All right, let's move on to Mr. Fadoju. You are of the media. How can the media tools be used in propagating all of these issues concerning disabilities?
Oh, well, thank you. I think I'd be focusing more here on the social media part. I think as it is in Nigeria, the youth make about 70% population, and I think and many of them are on social media. So our role here is to try to change a narrative of how they see people with disabilities, on how they imagine looking at a bus filled with blind people and you saying that is a blind bus. No, it's wrong. That's a wrong narrative. It's saying the bus with blind people is here. So our role is to help form this narrative, change how people see people that have got disabilities.
Okay, there's a conference that's coming up, the Conference on Disabilities from June the 22nd to the 25th. Annie, tell us, who should be part of this conference?
Everybody. The conference is going to be opened by the Executive Governor of Nasarawa State and the host governor, Akim Umiambodi. The conference is open to everyone. The focus of the conference is education, its health, its employment, and its social welfare. We should have people from the three tiers of society involved in the conference. By that, the public sector, the private sector, and the third sector. Because until we come together to create that tripartite model, to find a solution to a problem that is prevalent, we would not move forward. Like I said earlier, the way disabilities has been played is very tokenistic, is very charitable. It's really been played out by the international development partners and NGOs. The private sector is not involved because they've not engaged, they do not see the buying. Let me throw something at you. You go to a bank, the bank is not accessible. None of the banks are accessible to someone who's in a wheelchair or someone even with learning difficulties. I have a savings account and I go there, someone's just going to say, I don't understand what you're saying. So, for instance, we don't even have braille statements for the visually impaired in Nigeria. We don't have hearing impaired call centers. Do you not think, for instance, that if you had a bank that differentiated its good or its services product to service this unserviced sector, that they would not have a return on investment? They definitely would have a return on their investment. So we must change the narrative. For the business society, they need to see that there are about 40 million Nigerians who have one form of disability or the other, and I need to service their sector. I will make my money, but I need to service their sector. For the public sector, they need to understand that, you know what, we may not have the strongest budget, but we could create a public-private partnership. So, for instance, with the APC-led government that has come in, they've got good ideas about conditional grant transfers. The government necessarily does not need to provide the service. The government can provide the funds and then give you a voucher for you to go to a service center. Third thing, we need to change our tax structures. We need to make it efficient for companies that support maybe effective corporate social responsibility in the sector, or perhaps companies that, you know, for individuals that have a need or a disability or a need around disability, so that it makes it effective and from a financial point.
Mr. Haggerty, this is the first time this conference is coming to Nigeria. Why do you think, why the choice of hosting it in Nigeria for the first time?
Well, I will tell you, I think it's first of all, Nigeria is, I would say, very